girls out here about the bus. These fools out here afraid to bust.
Westside Connection record for my solo. Ice Cube doing on a solo or
in Mack 10.
Probably not. Probably
Damn.
not. I don't want to do another West.
You see the man who once embodied the unwritten law of the West Coast, the untouchable symbol of Westside Connection. Yet after decades of avoiding direct diss tracks and noisy media battles, he finally revealed a truth that left many people stunned. WC began naming the figures he had hated most deeply throughout his career. What sent an even colder chill through the community was that these were not outsiders. One man claimed cultural representation without ever truly living it. Another used power to bend history in his own favor. And one more, standing right beside him, allowed ego and ambition to tear apart a symbol of West Coast unity from the inside. So who were the ones that left the deepest cracks in WC's world? And among them, who was the name he truly hated, more than anyone else? Who WC is and why he does not hate carelessly. UC's real name is William LaShawn Calhoun Jr., born in 1970 in Houston, raised and active in Los Angeles. WC was never a solo operator in hip-hop. He formed low profile. Then the supergroup Westside Connection and the Mod Circle collectives that were never created to please anyone, but to tell the truth of the lives they were living. WC entered music without illusions and without a safety net. Major labels had little interest in this raw, street-heavy form of rap. So how did WC respond? No complaining, no begging. He kept writing, kept recording, kept releasing music his own way. No waiting for radio, no waiting for media approval. He built credibility from the ground up, one neighborhood at a time, one community at a time. The real turning point came in 1996, when Westside Connection released the album Bow Down. This record was not only controversial, it was a clear commercial success. Bow Down climbed high on the Billboard charts, sold millions of copies, and turned Westside Connection into one of the most powerful names on the West Coast at the time. More importantly, it proved that the voice of Los Angeles streets still had a place even as market trends were shifting. After that success, WC did not chase the spotlight. He did not use his position to show off or start meaningless wars. Instead, he chose to remain in the background. He continued supporting local artists, appearing on collaborative projects, and maintaining connections between generations of Los Angeles rappers. WC also became known as someone extremely serious about protecting West Coast language identity and discipline, to the point that he was later invited to coach young actors on street dialect and culture for film projects. But in a world where many use hatred as a ladder to climb, holding on to principles always comes at a cost. Honor creates friction. Principles create enemies. UC is living proof, a man who traded an entire lifetime to learn who was truly family and who was hiding a blade behind his back. DJ Muggs, when sonic territory is invaded. For WC, hatred never begins with emotion. It begins when someone deliberately stands in the wrong position and still behaves as if they have the right. And in the case of DJ Muggs, WC did not see it as a misunderstanding. He saw it as a deliberate intrusion. DJ Muggs is not just a producer, he is the brain, the architect, the man behind the control board deciding both the image and the voice of Cypress Hill. That position is exactly why WC no longer viewed Muggs as an innocent artist. Because Muggs did the one thing considered unforgivable to someone raised in Los Angeles street culture, he allowed his sound to speak for a land he never fully lived in. During the years Cypress Hill rose to prominence, the media and the market slapped the label West Coast Sound directly onto the music Muggs created. No distinction between LA and non-LA. No concern for which neighborhood, which streets, which history. Everything was bundled into a single convenient product for consumption. To WC, this was not media ignorance. It was a blatant occupation of space, and Muggs benefited from it. What truly fueled WC's resentment was not that Muggs's sound differed from LA. Hip-hop allows difference. What WC could not overlook was that Muggs never rejected that representative authority. To WC, silence here was not neutrality. It was complicity in erasing boundaries. The conflict deepened when tensions moved beyond music. As clashes between Westside Connection and Cypress Hill escalated, as the atmosphere edged closer to real-world violence, Muggs remained behind the mixer. Still supplying sound, still pushing the rhythm, still fueling the confrontation. In WC's world, this crossed a line of no return. The one who supplies weapons is never considered innocent. From that moment on, DJ Muggs was no longer a producer in WC's eyes. He became someone who stepped beyond the boundary without permission. No diss track was needed, no dialogue required, just a personal decision, no more respect. All of it combined into a boundary that had been trampled. Not through lyrics, not through diss tracks, but through attitude. And to WC, that is the ultimate taboo in street culture. But DJ Muggs, even though he struck a raw nerve, was still only the surface layer of the story. Because the next name was the one that brought WC the deepest pain. The one that shattered brotherhood and turned pain into war. Mack 10. The most devastating betrayal in hip-hop history. June 21st, 2001. Westside Connection officially disbanded. But for WC, it was not just the end of a group. It was the day he witnessed a West Coast symbol being torn apart from the inside by the ego and recklessness of its own members. The source of that collapse in WC's eyes did not come from external enemies. It came from Mack 10. Westside Connection had once been the strongest declaration of West Coast unity. 3 names, 3 personalities. One common front built from zero under media pressure, political tension, and East Coast-West Coast conflicts that never truly cooled. But when power and control began creeping in, the relationship between Mack 10 and Ice Cube fractured. The conflict was no longer about music. It revolved around decision-making final authority and who was allowed to run wild internally. WC was not naive. He understood Mack 10's anger at what he saw as excessive control from Ice Cube, more precisely Ice Cube's brother-in-law. WC himself had felt discomfort. But to him, this was the easiest problem to fix compared to what Westside Connection had already endured to rise. Sit down, adjust the rules, keep the lineup intact. To WC, that was the logic of someone who had survived long enough in street culture. But Mack 10 did not understand. Worse, he did not want to. Ego, recklessness, and a sense of challenged authority pushed him toward confrontation instead of repair. To WC, this was the moment everything went beyond control. It was no longer justified frustration. It was placing oneself above the collective. WC was dragged straight into the storm. He did not start it, he did not benefit from it, but he was forced to stand in the middle. Choosing Ice Cube meant betraying Mack 10. Choosing Mack 10 meant destroying the foundation of the group. WC chose neither. And that refusal cost him everything. Westside Connection fell apart. Mack 10 left. Ice Cube moved on his own path. WC remained standing in the rubble, carrying anger that never exploded but cut deep. To him, the most brutal betrayal is not a knife in the back. It is walking away when the entire system only needed a little compromise to survive. And Mack 10 became the symbol of WC's most painful lesson. Some kingdoms are not defeated by enemies, but destroyed by the ego of those inside. But Mack 10 was still not the final name that forced WC to watch a kingdom collapse from within. Ice Cube. When power destroys the collective. No one denies that Ice Cube is a legend, a pioneer, one of the rare West Coast figures to step beyond hip-hop and dominate film media and popular culture. But to WC, that immense power became a double-edged blade quietly eroding a collective that was once built on equal footing. When Westside Connection was formed with Mack 10, Ice Cube was no longer just a rapper. He was a superstar, with film studios, major contracts, media influence, and image control far beyond the other 2 members. On paper, Westside Connection was a group. In reality, Cube was often the main spokesperson, the one steering beefs, the one deciding how the group appeared publicly. Every major road led through Cube first. UC began to feel that Ice Cube was a boss, not a teammate. After bowdown and terrorist threats, Westside Connection fractured and then collapsed. In the years that followed, when discussing West Coast history or career eras, Cube rarely mentioned WC as a key part of Westside Connection. Mack 10 maintained a relatively stable relationship. WC, however, openly spoke about feeling pushed aside. I do not need to stand behind anyone to be recognized. Another issue that deeply troubled WC, though he never addressed it directly in the media, was the extent of Ice Cube's family involvement in group affairs. To WC, Westside Connection was hip-hop, the streets, the studio, and the stage. But Cube had already entered another world: film, business, family. And WC began to ask himself who was really making the decisions. According to some industry sources, Ice Cube's wife Kimberly was believed to have significant influence over behind-the-scenes decisions. Not in the studio, but in private life. WC never publicly criticized Kimberly, but he questioned why people who did not live hip-hop, who did not understand street logic, were gaining a stronger voice in shaping Westside Connection's future. There were whispers, repeated advice: Ice Cube should prioritize film, focus on business, protect his family, and distance himself from hip-hop, where risk conflict and street imagery could damage his personal brand. To WC, this was the moment he clearly felt a cold truth: the group was no longer being decided by those who lived for it. WC did not fight back. He did not expose anything. He did not name names. But in later conversations, he spoke in vague, loaded statements, allowing listeners to draw their own conclusions. There are decisions that do not come from the studio. To WC, that was the final cut. Quiet, no scandal. But enough for him to understand that Westside Connection did not fall apart only because of artist egos. It collapsed when hip-hop stopped being the center of the people who built it. Power did not destroy Westside Connection in a single day. It did something more dangerous: it created distance-fed egos and left those who once stood side by side feeling unseen. And when all the battles were over, the biggest question for WC was no longer who was right or wrong. It was, after everything, what was he left? With Q-Tip, When the East Coast Speaks to Grade. During the Bowdown era, when the West Coast was in a heightened defensive state against the East Coast, Q-Tip appeared in interviews, commentary, and the media landscape of the time. As an analyst, a commentator, a standard setter, Q-Tip is an East Coast figure, raised in New York, representing an intellectual and artistic strain of hip-hop. He did not live in LA, did not carry the street culture experience of the West Coast. But in the tense East-West climate, Q-Tip's presence was like pouring fuel on a fire. To WC, this was a direct insult, because in street code, anyone who did not live in that land has no right to define its value. What WC could not accept was that Q-Tip never rejected this role. He allowed the media to place him in the position of the greater, while the West Coast was placed below to be measured and compared. To WC, being insulted can be answered, but being judged from the outside quietly and intellectually is the deepest cut. But if this was only an ideological conflict, then the next blade, far more painful, came from within the West Coast itself. Common. The terrifying explosion of hip-hop. Common was never a gangsta rapper. He did not come from gun-filled LA alleys. He represented conscious hip-hop, reflective and philosophical, where rap is not used to threaten, but to question. In Common's world, hip-hop is a tool for inner reflection, social critique, and the search for enlightenment. Ironically, that very thing became the deepest point of collision with WC and Westside Connection. The issue was not about who rapped better, it was about how hip-hop was understood and used. To WC, hip-hop was born from the streets. It was the voice of people without choices, an honest record of violence, poverty, and daily survival. So when Common appeared with an intellectual image talking about hip-hop needing to raise consciousness and escape cycles of violence, that message did not sound neutral in WC's ears. It sounded like a denial of the lived reality of people like him. Common did not point guns. He did not insult directly. But that calm tone felt dangerous. Because when someone stands on a higher moral ground and says hip-hop needs to be better, the implied meaning is that what already exists is wrong. To WC and Westside Connection, this was no longer an artistic debate. It was a battle over values. One side said hip-hop must reflect the streets as they are. The other said hip-hop must rise above the streets. In the Bowdown context, when Westside Connection bluntly declared, "Westside is ours," every call for consciousness from figures like Common was read as condescension. Not because Common hated the West Coast, but because his message, however well-intentioned, placed people living in violence into a position of needing to be fixed. To WC, that was unacceptable. The streets are not a choice, they are circumstances. And no one has the right to sit far away and judge how they should be told. This conflict did not erupt into direct diss tracks. There were no guns in the lyrics, but it was more dangerous because it cut into ideological foundations. WC did not see Common as a personal enemy. He saw Common as a symbol of a strain of hip-hop gaining dominance in the media proper safe hip-hop easily celebrated by academia and the press. Meanwhile, street hip-hop was labeled violent, outdated something to be moved past. What truly disturbed WC was the imbalance of soft power. Common was listened to, invited to speak, treated as the voice of mature hip-hop. The voice of Westside Connection, on the other hand, was reduced to anger, aggression, and blind resistance. To WC, this was a quiet injustice. No one banned him from rapping. But his story was gradually treated as something that should not sit at the center. This was a bloodless war, no bullets, but it struck directly at lived values. It forced WC to face a painful question. Did street hip-hop still have a place when new moral standards were imposed from the outside? And if he did not resist, would people like him be erased from history by well-meaning praise? WC did not attack Common. He stayed silent. But that silence was not acceptance. It was the sign of a deep fracture, where hip-hop was no longer a shared front, but divided by value systems that could not be reconciled. In WC's eyes, Common was not evil, but he was proof that hip-hop was entering a new era, where those who lived in the streets had to ask whether their stories were still considered legitimate. UC's legacy. When all the battles faded into the background, when the names that once shook the media each went their separate ways, WC was the one who remained the longest among the ruins. Not because he won, not because he lost, but because he never left where he began. While many chose to move forward by rewriting the story in ways that benefited themselves, WC chose to stay with what was most intact. His legacy was not built on stage lights or applause, but on the endurance of a man who lived his entire life by principle. WC was never a loud rapper. He did not like grand statements, did not play the boss role, and had no interest in becoming the center of every conversation. Throughout his career, he maintained a certain distance from fame, not from lack of ambition, but because he understood the cost of standing too high. That is what makes WC's legacy difficult to see at a glance. He represented a form of hip-hop that is slowly disappearing hip-hop of unwritten law of equal respect, of the belief that within one crew, no one stands above another. After Westside Connection broke up, many assumed WC would disappear. To the media, he was no longer part of a big story. To the market, he was no longer an easy piece to sell. But WC did not disappear. He simply withdrew from the power game. He kept making music, kept appearing, kept being present in the community, but no longer placed himself at the center of major battles. To him, hip-hop was not a place to claim representation or control narratives. It was a place to keep one's word, protect honor, and hold one's rightful position in a world always trying to push others down to climb higher. What stands out in WC's legacy is that he did not leave behind an empire in the conventional sense. No film studios, no beverage brands, no massive media ecosystem. He did not build a personal empire that others must pass through when recounting history. What he left behind was a standard that a rapper can last in the industry without trading identity, a standard of standing beside great names without being dissolved, and a standard of knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. WC witnessed too many collapses from the inside. He saw groups fall apart not because enemies were too strong, but because egos were too large. He saw relationships severed not by bullets, but by power and self-interest. He saw promises bent when stage lights shined too long on one person. Because of that, WC's greatest legacy is not in album counts or awards. It lies in how he exited battles without losing himself. In mainstream hip-hop memory, WC is often placed on the margins, not because he mattered less, but because he did not fit the familiar victory narrative. He was not someone who rewrote history in his favor, nor someone who loved standing at a microphone retelling the past in its prettiest version. He carried the inconvenient parts of history, unresolved conflicts, cracks that were never sealed, questions without clear answers. In a culture that prefers neat endings, WC stands as a reminder that some stories never close. WC represents a generation of artists who deeply understood the cost of fame, who knew that every rise above others creates distance, that every fast step forward leaves something behind. That is why he chose to stand firm instead of standing tall. To those who grew up alongside him, WC is the image of someone who never betrayed the neighborhood that raised him. He never used street history as decoration for the present, nor turned pain into a commodity. To WC, what was lived through was not meant to be exploited, but remembered. UC's legacy also lives in the quiet respect he receives from those who truly understand hip-hop. No grand speeches, no dramatic comebacks, no carefully staged returns, just existing the right way. In an industry increasingly addicted to noise and image, WC proves that silence at the right time is also a form of power. A power that does not need to be proven, but is very hard to replicate. Looking back at WC's entire journey, one paradox becomes clear. He took part in big groups, big movements, big battles, yet ultimately became a symbol of solitude. Not solitude from abandonment, but from the lack of others still standing in the same place. Everyone chose a different path. Everyone adopted a different definition of success. WC did not change his definition. Success to him was never standing on top of others. WC's crown had no coronation. It was not certified by the media. It never appeared on power rankings. That crown exists in how he kept his word to himself, in how he never denied what he lived through, and in how he accepted that some legacies are never loudly celebrated, yet live a very long time in the memory of those who were there. In the end, WC's legacy does not answer who was right or wrong. It leaves a much harder question for modern hip-hop. Is there still room for those who do not want to be bosses, do not want to represent everyone, and do not want to rewrite history in their own favor? Is there still room for those who see hip-hop as a promise to themselves, not a tool for climbing power? WC survived every battle, but the price was standing alone at the end of the road. And in that moment, when there was no one left to blame or lean on, his legacy became clearest. Not loud, not flashy, but enduring, unyielding, and irreplaceable. WC's crown does not sit at the peak of power. It rests in a simple truth few can hold on to. He never bowed his head to anyone. You see the lonely crown. WC was never known for beef. He did not enter hip-hop with the ambition of becoming the loudest, the most aggressive, or the most frequently named figure in lyrical wars. WC's reputation was not built on diss tracks, nor was it fed by scandal. What earned him respect from the earliest days, until long after Westside Connection ceased to exist, came from things few people paid attention to: principles, restraint, and absolute loyalty to the unwritten code of the streets. In a culture where many confuse aggression with strength, WC chose the harder path. He chose silence when necessary. He chose not to cross lines even when he had reason to. He chose not to speak for others, not to represent others, not to step on anyone to stand higher. To WC, hip-hop was not a place where people won or lost by shouting the loudest. It was a place where everyone had to know where they stood and know when to stop. Because of that, WC did not hate many people. He did not live on impulse. But when hatred appeared, it did not come from jealousy or ordinary competition. It came from the moment a boundary was crossed, an unwritten rule was broken, or a collective was sacrificed for personal ego. That was not a passing anger. It was something remembered for a long time. After all the clashes, conflicts, and breakdowns, a cold reality emerged. Most of the people who once stood opposite WC disagreed with him, or even caused him deep harm, still kept their names. They are still mentioned in hip-hop history in their own roles. But Westside Connection is gone. The collective that once symbolized West Coast unity, that once spoke for a generation, that once created the feeling that the West could speak with one voice, completely dissolved. What hurt WC the most was not losing a group. It was losing an idea. The idea that people standing on the same front line could place the collective above power, fame, and personal interest. Westside Connection was not defeated by outside enemies. It collapsed because of decisions made outside the studio, because power was no longer balanced, and because egos refused to make room. After everything ended, WC was the one who stayed, quietly, without long interviews to argue right and wrong, without dragging anyone into the public eye for explanations. He understood that not every battle needs to be won, and not every story needs a clear ending. Some things only need to be remembered so they are not repeated. In WC's memory, those conflicts were neither trophies nor stains. They were lessons. Lessons that culture can be violated without guns. Lessons that family and brotherhood can be broken without shouting. And lessons that power, when left unchecked, will quietly rewrite history in favor of whoever holds the biggest microphone. The crown WC stands on never had a spotlight. There was no coronation, no cheering crowd. It is the crown of someone who chose to keep the rules instead of chasing the moment. Someone willing to be misunderstood, pushed aside, even forgotten, as long as he did not betray what he believed was right. In a culture that often rewards noise, WC accepted the reward few want: silent respect. Looking back on the road behind him, WC does not ask what if he had won a certain battle. He asks what if fewer people had forgotten the unwritten code. Because to him, hip-hop was not just music. It was a way of living, a way of keeping your spine straight in a world that constantly wants you to bow your head or climb on someone else's back to move forward. And in that world, WC chose to stand still, when needed, even if the price was solitude. Maybe that is why WC's story never has a complete Hollywood ending. There is no perfect reunion, no comeback album to close everything neatly. There is only one man moving forward, carrying the memory of battles that did not need to be won, and of a collective that once existed but is no longer present. And now the question no longer belongs only to WC. It belongs to the listener of this story. If you were WC, who would you hate the most? The one who disrespected the culture from the outside, or the one who destroyed the family from within? Because sometimes in hip-hop, as in life, the deepest wound does not come from the person standing across from you, but from the one who once stood in the same line.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.